Christina Watani is known for editing Homeroom, Fruits of Labor, and Midnight Traveler. Her work has been awarded a Peabody, an Emmy, and she was also the recipient of the Sundance Jonathan Oppenheim Documentary Editing Award in 2021, as well as Doc NYC's 40 Under 40 list. Welcome, Christina.
I'm still under 40.
We're going too fast. Leslie is the director of editing at Contemporary Films. She was on the edit team of The First Step, which we made at Tribeca, and also worked on the Milo series, which was nominated for a Critics' Choice Award. She edited and co-wrote Raising Birdie, the award-winning The Homestretch, as well as Asco's Janesville. Welcome, Leslie. And last but not least, Flavia. Jacinda is a co-director and co-editor of Aftershock, winner of the Special Jury Award at the Sundance in 2022. She also edited the Academy Award nominated short documentary Open Heart and the Emmy Award-winning film On Good Faith. So to get us started, I've been thinking about the way in which my process resembles editing, writing, and sort of resembles writing. So sometimes I take pieces of a interview and compile them on a little document and put them up to like rearrange them into some sort of order that makes sense, even chronological or story-wise, or even in a verite scene. If you're not doing that, you're doing some form of writing, even if there's less options in the verite scene. So my first question to you all is, in what ways does your editing process resemble writing?
Sure. First of all,
downstairs, Steven.
no, it's okay. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you to all the organizers and staff who put this together. So I wanted to, I guess, just start with a quote that I think is really good. And I pulled this from the ADE guide for edit schedules. And I really feel this and like think of this as part of my process. And this is from a producer named Travis Swartz. So thank you, Travis. But it says, editing a documentary is akin to someone handing you a bag of sentences and asking you to write a book. And I think I might break that down even a little further to be like, maybe it's like getting a bag of words or letters, you know what I mean? It's like, my initial process, I think when I'm editing, the way my brain works and the types of project I've worked on have been like, I begin textually, like in my mind, like once I can figure out either dialogue or if there's narration or anything like that. If I can do that initially, it sort of frees up my mind to work on telling the story visually or sonically. And so I guess in that way, beginning with words is sort of how my process resembles writing.
Flavia, she, her. I have gray curly hair. I'm wearing a blue shirt. I'm a cis woman, and I'm Brazilian Yes. And sometimes I get stuck on words in English that I can't remember. So I echo what Steve says. I think the statement about being handed the bag of words is very true. And sometimes those words don't even exist in the world that you are presented. I have found myself in situations where I ask for the words to be gotten. I love the directors. Sometimes say, what do you mean? I don't have access to that person anymore. Well, you just do what you have to do. You have to just go to church. Just, you know, um, but yes, so I very much think, I think I have a strong background in television. That's what I started doing first. Back in the late 90s, I started as an editor. So I'm a big believer in the radio cuts. I think my process starts with the words generally, not 100% of the time, but it does start with words and very often, even if it's a very big film, I start with a quote unquote radio cut, which is a term that is very much a television term, and I don't even know that editors start to say that today.
Yep.
Yeah. And so, and sometimes to focus the story, to say something with economy, you make sentences. They aren't necessarily untrue. They are just condensed versions, simplified versions, or clearer versions of what the subjects say in reality. And in other ways that what I do resembles writing is that I think we very much all, unless we are handed a script, which is in my life not very often, we start with the empty, the blank page, right? And I'm very scared of it. Still, after this many years, yeah.
So, I'm Christina, pronouns she, her. I've got brown hair, long hair. So I guess my process is I typically work on these kind of longitudinal, long verite documentaries where there's a large shooting ratio, hundreds and hundreds of hours. And typically somebody is like, I have all this stuff. What now? What do I do? And so I guess in a way that's like related to writing is I take all of that stuff and I try to firstly organize it in a way that makes sense and break it apart to build character arcs or things that are more manageable, biting off the pieces. And last year I did novel writing month. I don't know if anybody else has ever done that. And I was writing a fiction novel, which I've never done before. And I was like shocked at how the process is so similar to what I had been doing for years, editing documentaries. And it's just the logical way that you're thinking about structure and what's going where and what can work for this and that. You're doing that when you're writing on the page too. So in that way, I see a similarity. We're storytellers, right? So we've started out this conversation talking a little bit about words, which is a very direct reference to what writing is. But words are just the very first stones for creating what we're creating. They are the way that we help to tell the story, but we're the people who are frequently the people. I mean, let's clarify. Oh, I'm sorry. First of all, Leslie Simmer here. I'm an older woman with wavy gray hair, wearing a sleeveless black top. And yes, thank you very much to everyone who's been making this possible and to everyone here. I appreciate that. So we're talking about words as the way that we actually start to like roll this out. But we're telling the story with the pieces that we've been given. And sometimes that goes from the know exactly the book that you're writing when you start, but you know that there has to be a way that you start it that makes people want to read it or makes people want to watch it. And you have to have an ear or head of a writer in order to understand what draws people in and what is going to engage them continually and to change it. Writing is rewriting, editing is re-editing.
So I feel as though there's so many similarities, the way that you create a story arc, the way that you use the visuals that you've been given in order to support all the things that you're trying to say. You are trying to, in the most genuine and authentic way, write the stories of the people who have given you their lives and time on this film, so.
All excellent points. Thank you. And really interesting processes for sure. Yeah, I never thought about the word part of it quite so succinctly, so thank you for that. I want to get into a little bit of the specifics of, I guess, the is in the room is the credit. And it is in every room, in every project, on every film. And sort of, you know, documentary, don't quote me on this, but I guess classically, it's in a lot of ways comes with a writer sometimes, more traditionally, right? And, you know, I was checking out someone's IMDb yesterday and he had like 46 some odd credits on writing credits on documentaries. Not as just as a writer, not as an editor. So I guess my question is like, how have you gone about asking for this credit, just sort of to give the audience a sort of background into what brought it about and how to advocate for it themselves too, if that's happening for them.
Okay. This is Leslie again here. Well, breaking it down a little bit, I don't think that a writing credit for an editor is necessarily appropriate for every film that we're editing. I think that the majority of the people on stage here were crafting films, Christina, as you said, from, you know, much material and that are going to be more verite type films, probably using interviews as well as verite scenes. I think that if you're working on a scripted documentary that, and you know, it's been written, then obviously that's not appropriate. I'm not, and I also don't ask for, I would never ask for a writing credit if the director is not themselves asking for a writing credit. Because I feel as though the ethics of that question are very sensitive and need to be considered. But I feel if I have done as much writing as the director has done, then I want to have that conversation. And I've had it several times and actually received the writing credit several times in that way. I also feel as though that conversation about whether it's appropriate to get a writing credit should be extended if you've had the discussion with the director and you both feel as though writing credits are in consideration, that it should be extended to the people who are the protagonists in your film, because you're using their words and their images. And I think that there should be a conversation to discuss what has been crafted and if they feel that it's appropriate as well.
Yeah, I think there are several, you know, type. There is a gamut of, you know, how documentaries get in the process of editing goes. And obviously in films where there's narration, the video written, that's an obvious thing. And sometimes the director writes that alone. Sometimes the I certainly have written with the director, you know, there's narration sometimes in rough cuts, you know, the beginning stages, I'll have cards on the screen that say, here we need the line that says, I'm wearing a blue shirt, you know. And then together we or I hand it to someone who makes that pretty or whatever. So that's sort of the obvious, whomever's doing that, right? Either it's the director alone or the editor alone or the editor with the director, then that person deserves the writer credit, and then it gets sort of grayer in cases where there is no actual obvious writing. Right? Yeah, if we are handed a script, then we are doing more conventional editing, what text editing would be, right? What does the book editor does? They reorganize something that's pre-written. But very, very often in independent documentaries, there is no outline or script. And I think in a lot of cases, the editor should be getting the writer credit, if anyone is. I agree with Leslie that if the director is not getting it, so there's no writer, okay, sure. So it's understood that the editor edited, the director directed, whatever specific activities that mean. You had a story though, that you were hoping you were gonna tell. Sorry about that. Sometimes those, I think at the root of it all, is the question of what the editor does in the documentary, right? And whether you want to attribute it to, you want to sort of put it under the umbrella of writing. It's the best approximation we have. I think it's not ideal. It's not exactly equal to typing up words. We are working from a universe that is predetermined. Sometimes not, but it's largely predetermined words that exist that someone said. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a writer, writing professor, and I was talking about the show I'm editing now, and talking about the pearls and all this analogy of the pearls you find, and that's especially true in Verity. I think you find this pearls in the mud, and you find them and you string them in a necklace, right? Decide what comes first, how much you need to know at this point, how many pearls go in this cluster, and then and that he said that he uses the same analogy with his students, that in reality, when a writer that's pulling the words and the sentences out of their imagination, you know, these, you can argue that these are also pre-existing in a language, right? And that he uses the same analogy of the finding the pearls in the mud with his writing students. What was the original question again? Oh, about the credit, and I feared.
Yeah, well, it's just how you receive them, like, do you put them in your contract up front, do you? Put them
I've
them
never,
actually?
like, terrible at these things, admittedly, and I would never. Also, because I think going in, you often don't know how much writing you're gonna do, or how much co-directing, how much producing. Oh, and what I was gonna say, yeah, at the root of it all is what the editor does, and sometimes I was given, for example, a co-producer credit in a film, right? And I did not participate in production, in post-production, yes, I was running post completely, but I didn't go on shoots. I did write questions for interviews that were done after I had come along, after we had started editing. But a lot of times, given this other credits, producer or writer speak to the that what nobody's really sure what the editor does outside of our niche. Yeah, and that will give you, we credit you to like awards and stuff, which was the case in my co-producer credit. So the director was very smart about that, because the editor's not, he's often not considered like the core creative team. Or inhabitants of the awards and institutions.
Yesterday, we had a breakout room for editors that was actually really wonderful and fruitful. And there was some stuff that was talked about that was kind of blew my mind, that in Argentina, and I guess it's also common in France, that if you're talking to a director about coming on as an editor, if they do not have a script, you automatically are going to get a writing credit. Like, that is the standard in those places. And that made me really start to think about this question about when do you ask for the credit? Because my inclination has always been like, well, you kind of want to show them that you've done the writing before you go, hey, by the way, maybe we should also have a writing credit. But now I'm a little bit like, maybe it should be the first, in those first conversations of like, this is what the expectation is going to be. I'm going to be doing, besides just doing the technical part of editing, I am also going to be collaborating with you on the story in such a way that it warrants this other credit, and just having that expectation out the door. I do think that that may intimidate a lot of directors. I'm not quite sure, but I'm also, it just blew my mind that in these other places, that's the expectation. So many people in our breakout rooms were also, you could just tell, very much craving to have a writing credit and wanting to at least like have the guts to ask. And it's like in these places, you don't even have to have the guts to ask. It's expected to be part of the conversation at the very least. So that kind of changed my thinking about it a little more.
Yeah, that's a great point. Excuse me. Yeah, I think in thinking about this, so I've never received a writing credit on a film. In my experience, I'd say like half the films I've done have been sort of more interview based. Occasionally there's a outline, like a loose script in some cases. And I think about two films that I worked on that kind of like helped me think about this in relation. One was called The Voice of Freedom, which is the PBS American Experience doc. I came into the project at a point where there was a fair amount of kind of scratch narration written, and there were kind of interview bites that were, I think very few of the interviews have been shot at that point, but there were like, you know, answers that the director and producer hoped to get, you know, sort of slotted into certain spots that they pulled from books, you know, from these experts and things like that. It wasn't a situation in which I had time to like do much research of my own, you know, I like did as much as I could to kind of like, you know, educate myself enough to effectively edit this documentary, right? I would be really welcomed by the director to give feedback on text, let's say before we even started cutting anything, things like that. So it was collaborative, but I wouldn't presume to call myself a writer in that sense. I worked on another film called King in the Wilderness, which like is a situation in retrospect where I thought, maybe I would have had a case for, you know, requesting a writing credit, but I only realized this after the fact when the film, I think, maybe had 2 writers' credits. For sure, there was one, I believe, for a writer named Chris Schwong, very talented, smart guy who had put together a fairly detailed outline and maybe even assembled some bites, I don't know, selects of sort of targets where we were trying to go. But in the process of working on that film, the first thing that my fellow editor, Maya Muma, and I did was to screen like hours and hours and hours of archival footage, right, ourselves. And some of it, again, it was collaborative. The director had done some, the archival researcher had done some, but we were like really finding dialogue within these archival pieces of footage, you know, like pretty significant things that formed key scenes or, you know, transitions, hit certain structural story beats and things like that. And in a few cases, like found some gems where it was like, wow, like no one has seen this footage even since it was originally shot. And some of those moments of dialogue like helped make stories possible. And so in that instance, like if I were, that was one of the first, I think that was the first film where I received an editing credit a few years ago. And I think if I had my awareness now, I would be like, yo, like, you know, I think I have a case for being like, since there is a writing credit, I feel like I have a case for either like a co-written or written by, like along with the editing credit. And I guess that brings to mind like sort of another point, which is like, I think like Christina was talking about in like having this discussion up front, like seems like editors are brought in at different points on projects, right? And I feel like in cases where I've been brought in early enough to really have an influence before, you know, a whole lot of stuff is formed, it sort of gave me an ability to have more or less of an influence, you know, on the structure, you know, what I would think of as the text or the script of the film. And so I think that's a case where, if possible, it's nice to be able to come in, you know, earlier in the process before things get really like set in stone. If there is that kind of wiggle room, I guess.
Yeah, I guess one of the sort of questions I've always been thinking about with this credit and just general crediting, but specifically this one, is that like, what is the value of it?
Money.
Yeah, no, I think a little bit of it too is like, there's like thought about it of, well, if we give them a writing credit, it diminishes our credit. And it's like, that's not what it is. And I think we need to reframe that somehow. Because I do think that sometimes like that's been the vibe when it's like, well, you know, I also participated in this and this and this, which is not really just editing here. And it's like, well, but then, you know, I don't know if that makes my credit seem less important. And that's not what it is. So I think that's part of it, but also it's just like, you just want to give people credit for their fucking good ideas. Sorry, I swear. I just want credit for my good ideas. That's all.
I think part of it too is, you know, we've all been talking about this. There's just a general kind of lack of awareness in the larger world about what editors do. I mean, at one point, my brother-in-law said, how hard is it to like put a picture next to another picture? You know, it's like, okay. No, he's about 35. He's dead to me now. So. But there's this like, okay, so in the general public, okay, where do you like encounter what an editor is, like besides the publishing world? So, okay, so you got the Oscars, right? And there's an editing credit at the Oscars, and that editing credit virtually always goes to feature fiction editors, and they, you know, super talented people who are doing an amazing job, but they're working from scripts. Initially, I'm sure that things get moved around and everything, and we're doing something that's very different from that. And there's no sort of larger acknowledgement about the fact that what we do is not that. And just by virtue of the fact that you never see documentary editors even like proposed for something like that, makes you feel like, well, what is, you know, we chopped liver? Like, are we doing so much less? You know, and we're not, obviously, we're not. So some of it is just like, I mean, this has been a conversation that I've had for like 15 years already. It's like, some people in the editing world are like, oh, no, we should get like co-director credits. And for me, I feel like, no, it's not co-directing, because I didn't establish relationships, identify who the participants are and establish relationships with them and raise the money for it and go along with the film afterwards and, all of that. And I'm not a producer, but I am writing. And so that helps to sort of place it a little bit. And so I guess it's just kind of like, so some people are like, well, but writing is what we do as an editor. Okay, so if you're saying writing is what we do as an editor, but nobody knows that that's what we're doing, some of it is just like what you were saying, you just kind of want credit for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I guess the question is more about like also what is having it as well as the editing credit, what is the value of it besides the editing credit? I mean, you said that it's like making a point of how much you're doing or part like people not understanding it, but is that its value then?
I think so. I mean, in the past couple of years in particular, I've never really been in the narrative world at all. And now I have some friends that are in that world. And when I'm telling them about the things that I'm doing in editing a documentary, their jaw drops every time and they go, "You're doing all that?" What the hell? I had no idea that the documentary editor was so involved in the story and does all these things. And in our bubble, in this world, everybody knows, and it's pretty widely accepted. And but once you step outside of this, nobody has any freaking clue. They think you're just the person who knows how to use Premiere Avid, So
And like, tell people who work, directors or producers that work more often for television, like network televisions. This guy that does a lot of series for BBC, the other day we were having a casual conversation, and he's like, what? They didn't give you a script? He just could not fathom that. No, there is no script. I screened 25 interviews and went up with a 15-minute moment. It's magic. That's why it takes magic 10 months and not, 6 weeks or whatever those schedules they want to enforce. Yes.
Yeah, I would say, I think about the value kind of in two ways. I mean, I think on one level, having that credit is valuable personally because I think in some ways, we're all like diverse people with diverse interests and, like, I don't know, I feel like a lot of editors, I don't know, are like into music and, all sorts of different things, design, graphics, etc. And so I think maybe on some level that it helps communicate something about and an interest and may communicate since we still have this, since we're still trying to figure out the term and still trying to figure out, meaning between like an effective term between editor and writer. It might also communicate to, a prospective team that you're collaborating with, like kind of what your experience is and interests, I guess. So I think about that. And then whatever, there's, maybe we'll get into this later, but there's, questions of benefits and, dough and stuff like
Tell us
that.
about those, Steven.
Well, we can get there, but just to
We're
say-
ready.
well, the other part of what I was going to say was in terms of value, I think there's I don't know, maybe a social value in communicating with audiences, like the general public, in terms of kind of like media literacy, I guess, and sort of like helping break down. Like, I didn't go to film school personally, like I went to school for art and I didn't know much about like what the various roles were and stuff like that. And I don't know, it's taken me 10 years to, I guess, like figure it out. But I think of it as a way to, if we can kind of draw attention to like what goes into making films for people in, broader audiences who maybe are not privy to that or trained in that. I think of it as a way to help people kind of deconstruct what is creating meaning that we're seeing, and like maybe ask questions about how things are made and things like that. So I think in terms of, you know, as long as it isn't confusing, like having that credit uh, might be good, just in terms of educating people and helping them have some footing to be like, wait a minute, you know, what went into the, you know, making this, like who edited this, who directed this, like, you know, who assembled this, etc. Yeah.
Also, as we are moving into this era of documentaries having more of an entertainment
Right.
value, right? People wanting to fill their space.
Yes, the popularity.
Growing so much of a part, which in my career, I saw, there's a sharp difference from now and, the year 1999 in the demand, the appetite for documentaries. It's, it's forces or taps into the conversation of, are documentaries just portraying the truth, the myth of the fly on the wall, these are stories that we were making decisions. Even Fred Wiseman was making decisions. What you turn your camera to, what can, there are questions, a subject involved, what questions you asking, and then ultimately we are the last ones, maybe the editors are the last ones making those choices. The old adage of 1,000 lies to tell a bigger truth. There are lies, not necessarily lies, but there are choices all the way through. When you write, you make those choices. There's an argument against the editor getting it, the writer, the writing credit in documentaries in general, because it implies that it's not, a documentary film is not a document, it's of reality. And well, it's not in a way. It's choices are being made all the way through. And when you write, you make those choices. It's interesting to me that nonfiction writers, like journalists that write for print, are not, they are accepted as writers, whereas for documentary filmmaking, there's this case that people make for, oh, if there's a writer, then the story that you seen, that's not true.
Yeah.
I think it's a sensitive issue because you don't want to claim authorship for somebody else's story either, someone's life story. You didn't create that story, that's narrative, but you are making it into a story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like you said, you don't want to take ownership of people's words or anything, but we are participating in a craft, right? We're, making something. And so, and like you said, I don't think like general public would look at an article in a magazine or newspaper and think that the journalist, I mean, I don't know, I guess this is a fraught topic, but think that, or question the appropriateness of the journalist having a byline or, right.
I do think there's ways that we're sort of, I was talking to Mary Lamson about this subject because I wanted her brain on this subject, and she said, we're the stepchild of the future, the narrative, not narrative, my God, not fiction, all the wrong words. Apologies to everybody, to the fiction field, and arguably documentary came first, blah blah blah. But is it trying to fit like a round peg into a square hole situation? Do we after it's formed so much like of its own canon documentary? Is that what the problem is?
Documentary these days is so fluid and so beautiful because of that, because of all these different potentials for hybridization and the millions of ways that you can approach that. I mean, that's writing. And yet it's documentary. I mean, this conversation will continue about that and about what the ethics are. I would say at this point, I would like to claim that audiences understand that if they're watching a documentary and there's a writing credit, that they're not all of a sudden going to say, oh, this isn't a documentary then. I think that documentaries are ubiquitous enough, hopefully, that people have come to that. And certainly there's, well, at any rate. But yes, I think into the future, the idea that we're the stepchildren or it has to just be a certain way, that's already been kind of exploded and it's going to continue to explode into the universe, I hope anyway. And then maybe the question of writing will become less of a question. I mean, certainly, if you're doing a personal documentary and you're doing it, you can take a writing credit on that. And it's a question if you're working with an editor on that, would that editor then, I mean, it's a question between you and your director at that point, but yeah, I have to say on that. I'm just gonna
Point, and I will take questions from the audience in the chat. So prep them. I guess in some ways, personally, I felt that this quote unquote fight for this credit feels a little bit upside down to me in terms of how we think about what we do, because arguably the editor has the biggest line item in a budget. Christina's listening. She agreed, everybody. She agreed. Producers are balancing multiple projects at the same time. Directors are pulling this thing to the finish line over so many years, doing so many different roles that they arguably shouldn't have to do alone. And the great abolitionist Mariam Kaba says that anything worth doing is not worth doing alone. And Mary Lamson once more said that this world that we work in is an authoritative world. It's not a word, but I want it to be a word. And that's opposite of what film is, what filmmaking is. It really takes a lot of people to make things good and time. So to me, there's ways that rather than fighting it from the bottom up, which means to me feels like we're fighting for writing credit and to do more, is saying in some ways that it's okay for this to all be on your shoulders. So I'm wondering if you agree with that, or if we should be fighting for more, not upside down, to fighting for more resources, fighting for more resources for everybody on the team. And I specifically am meaning independent documentary. I don't mean, well-funded shows, obviously, because it doesn't feel like that's always the case with the writing credit.
You mean bring on more writers to the project so that?
No, I mean money.
Less money.
I mean money.
I mean, it's hard because I don't think any of us want to feel like we're, whining about this is really hard, give us more. But it's also it is really hard, give us more. But I want to do the collaboration. I do want to do all these things that I'm saying I'm doing all this extra. I want to do those things, like, that's actually the part that I'm good at, and like, I wanna have that relationship with the film and the director and everything, and I wanna be a contributing factor, so it's like, I wouldn't like to just like not have the writing credit and do less work, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, I don't know, it's hard if you say, well, you bring on more resources, then I'm wondering, well, does that mean that then somebody else is doing that work? I guess you're saying no, but
I'm saying that, like, what if your director wasn't doing like 17 other jobs?
being fair, I love that. That would be great.
So then they would be more present, more able.
Yeah.
Or the producer was able to sort of be more present in the room, in the edit room with you, or whoever else you want to be in the assistant editor, then
Yeah,
shout out to the assistant editor.
yes,
Yes.
mine's right
Yes.
there.
Who could have time to learn how to make stories and not just transcode. You know, what would that mean? That
Yeah, all those things, yes.
Mary Mattingly said infamously to me, she was like, I'm gonna die soon. There's not gonna be anybody to take over if we're not training AEs to cut. So train your AEs to cut, everyone.
Just we're in this world of, everybody in their own house. So yeah, it's hard. I recognize it. Like when I stayed at AE for a very long time in the mid-90s with one editor, it was a true like apprenticeship process. And I sound old by saying that, oh, back in the old days, we used to have apprenticeship, but I think it's kind of the only way to learn this job. How does that all translate to location of resources and money? Above my pay grade, no pun intended. But yeah, and the thing about the directors not having to have 15 different jobs, oh my God, I only wish, yeah, like Christina, I went into this because of the collaborative aspect. I can only do collaboration. I cannot do anything else. So it's hard if not everybody else in the team is willing to do that or available to do that.
On the other hand, I don't necessarily want a director in with me every day. Sorry,
Yeah,
I
that's
gonna say that, no offense.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, as an editor or any other creative things, it's like having some solitude at times, it's like this balance. And I think in the cases of let's say well-funded or more heavily staffed situations, sometimes like there's a point of diminishing returns in a way where like there's so many people involved, there's so much thrown at things, like trying to fix things, or that that it actually like doesn't really end up being like collaboration. It like ends up being like we're all scrambling just to make something happen. You know what I mean? So I think
It's a problem of too many cooks too, for
yeah,
sure.
exactly. That's another way of saying it. So
And there's also the solitude that is inherent to the work that we do. I don't mean the director sitting next to me at all times. Not definitely not, but like with it having the same kind of stakes in telling the story and this putting the same kind of energy. That's all.
Getting in the same headspace with
Headspace.
each other.
Yeah, I think, there's a definite, capitalist tendency to throw as many bodies on a project as possible, as if that's gonna make it go faster. When actually the person that's been working on it the longest and has like this real relationship with the work is actually much better at doing the thing that we definitely need more time and money. Not just money. But yeah, I think that's definitely an excellent point.
yeah, and I also wonder, like with conversations that are emerging about, or have been here, I guess, about kind of like non-hierarchical structures and collectives and things like that, if maybe we'll get to a point where the terms we have are sort of obsolete and there's a like needs to be a new way of thinking about.
Yes.
There was a panel,
This is what I wanted to plan. Okay.
I think it was The Artist Has Power or one of the other panels earlier that this discussion came up, and I thought that was really interesting. And like, I don't really know, I'm a novice as far as knowing anything about that, but that was really inspiring. So shout out.
I just want to say that when Cartemplin was first started in the 60s, every film that they made, nobody had specific titles, like everybody's name was on every film, which was absolutely aspirational. And now I just want to add that everybody who did that is now really pissed off about it.
Yes.
And it, Leslie, what?
Yeah, I mean, that's also
Hearing those stories.
recognized, you know, like for these, yeah. So like, I don't know.
I shouldn't have said that.
Just stopped like a scene early. To the end and I want it. We have about 10 minutes, I think, for audience questions.
There, yeah, hi, my name is Julia Marianska, independent filmmaker. I just want to validate what was said earlier about the editor not being credited or recognized yet at the academy level or industry level as one of the main creatives. I really hope that absolutely changes. I see the editor as one of the top creative in the project. And my question stems from the breakout session with editors that I was in yesterday, where there was this nuanced conversation about crediting a build editor versus a polish editor, which I found very interesting and makes me wonder about, for you all who are at your level of editing, how is it for you to come onto a project that has already a rough assembly? Do you do that? Do you want that? What are the pros and cons of that? What happens if the director also has a hand in editing and kind of hands that over, maybe instead of a script to work off of? I'd be curious to hear the feedback and thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was on that breakout too, and I guess my knee-jerk reaction is like, oh shit, like what? Like, I don't know, like it's a conversation, but I don't think you know, I'm leaning away from that idea, but I do think yeah, I mean, like I've been in situations where like I took a cut to like fine cut stage or like a second rough cut stage, and then I had to go to another project or something like that. I would fully expect that I'd be credited as an editor on that. And then whoever else come on, like if they did a real significant amount of work on the film, they would also get an editor credit, you know. Or if they only did a little bit, like maybe there was an additional or some, you know, some other title to kind of negotiate. I think also like it has to do with like when a person comes into the project and the state that the project is in. Like I had an experience where there had been an editor working for a while, and like the editor left for whatever reason. Nothing had really been, you know, like there wasn't much to work on. Like at the time that kind of been for naught. You know, like, and I don't think that person got a credit, you know, and I think, but if I was coming into a situation where someone had spent a fair amount of time on, I totally think they should just be credited as an editor as opposed to like breaking this down into further categories, like polish, bill, I don't know. Because I think there's situations where like people are doing both, you know, and then how do you break that down?
It's hard to make those limitations too. I've been on both sides of the line, like coming to a film that already had an assembly or rough cut, that as second editor. To work on the film, which by the way, I love doing, I'll do that anytime. And then the opposite, not finishing a project because I had to move on to the next one. And in all these cases, I'm trying to think, I think I simply shared the editor credit on the same page with the other editor whose name came first was, the discussion. It depends how long they've been on it.
I have just one more thing also, is that it seems like the longer I'm editing or the more films I do and more time goes on, like in the bit, what I think of as a building phase, like, you're trying to get an assembly together, or a rough cut together to like show, your EPs or, director or something. Often it's like, okay, we need 5 minutes of this, that looks like a fine cut, like this is a rough cut, in air quotes, but like actually it needs to be like stored, or I even want you to color it a little bit and blah blah blah. So it's like,
Other credits.
yeah,
It's a negotiation. I mean, I think at this point it's a negotiation. I would feel very uncomfortable with there being like really standardized. Like, this is what you did, this is what you did. Because it's gonna look and walk a little bit different on every production, I think.
Let me balance it out a little bit and take a question from the chat. Oh my God. A question from Jim, asks, how can we help directors and producers better understand the contributions of editors?
I mean, kind of hope that the directors. But producers, I don't know. I mean, I think this goes back maybe a little bit to the education part that we were talking about earlier, that people just aren't aware necessarily of all of the things, all of the hats that we wear and all of the pots we have our fingers in when working in documentary as editors.
yeah. I think also it kind of depends on those people's experience, like, if they're coming over from news, or maybe they're journalists who are first time directors or what have you, there might be kind of a lack of understanding, not necessarily even what an editor does, but how to work together,
Right,
Double
and a
asterisk.
lot of directors or producers do, I think. I love working with directors that used to be editors. And I was lucky to
Oh my
have
God.
that a few
Dream.
times. Yeah, so yeah, they do.
I've been pretty lucky that way. I feel like most of the directors and producers that I've worked with have a full understanding of that. And most of the time have been free with credits and shout outs and stuff. There was only one situation where that wasn't happening, and I still don't know why. But yeah, and I also sometimes have recommended to my directors that they might want to think about trying editing sometime. So
You want to get in there?
Any other questions from the audience? I'll take.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael. My background is as a writer, and so there's no question in my mind that what you all do is writing. But my bigger question is like repositioning the role of the editor, like just getting writing credit solve the bigger problem of like repositioning the role of the editor as being sort of that line item of importance as all of the other roles.
Yeah, I think it doesn't solve it completely. As I said, I think towards the beginning of this, it's like an approximation. It's what we have available. Co-producer, writer, all these other not exact ways of describing why we do, but it may help a little bit. Writer is more universal knowledge than, doc editor. Yeah. It's all these approximations, all those ways that help educates and I don't like using that word either, not educate. Is that what I want to be educated on my position, but acknowledgement, I guess. But another approximation, I was talking to someone earlier today, is I worked with a director that in all his films, the editor credit comes second. After director, editor is second. That's another way that I think is nice to, of acknowledging who is part of the core creative team.
Yeah, or it could be first, like I was, seriously, like I was lucky enough to have an experience where like that was the first. My mom was happy to be able to like see the photo, so, does that answer your question a little bit?
Gonna keep taking questions until he gets done. I'm gonna take one from the Zoom, just to be fair, apologies. Is there a time during the post-production process that's most appropriate to ask for writing credit? Toward the end of an edit or in the middle when the writing work start to kick in?
And this is kind of what I was talking about before, but it's like, yeah, it's a hard question to answer because my first inclination is like, well, I think somewhere in the middle. When you're like, okay, like I've looked at what we've done at this point and I've clearly contributed this. I think it's really hard to do it at the very end. Just because it's like, well, this was the expectation the whole time, that these were the credits that everybody was getting. So it's kind of like, can be difficult at that point to kind of switch the thinking. But and initially, again, I was kind of like, I don't know if you ask right at the beginning, but now I'm leaning more towards maybe you ask at the beginning. Maybe it is good to just set the expectation out the gate that this is what's like expected and this is what I want and this is what the work I'm going to provide you and the way I'm going to participate in this film. I'm kind of leaning more towards that. I'll let you know if it works out because I don't know yet. But
To advocating for what you want.
yeah,
My choice for an augmented credit is after you had a successful screening, for example, or you sent the film to the executives and they like it, they like the cut.
That's a hot tip right there.
In my experience, I feel like it's good to out the gate, like just sort of like if you can, first of all, to as best as we can get an understanding of like what the role is actually going to entail, like from the team if they can articulate that, and maybe at that stage be like, okay, what you are going to need for this. Like there's definitely like a writing credit or whatever credit should to that. I feel like it's harder later in the process to kind of negotiate things or feel like like I've felt before that, oh, are they going to be upset because I'm like, like renegotiating in a way later, based on the work. So I feel like that can put a lot of pressure on the individual who's asking for the credit to sort of do it later and like kind of ask for that generosity.
I've kind of done it both ways. I've also advocated for, I've had directors approach me and say, hey, my editor is asking for a writing credit. What do you think about this? And then I was very happy to preach. I believe she got the writing credit.
Everyone email Leslie when you need.
But also there's a point in time when you're working on a film and like crediting is a discussion. Like you're just like, well, who should get what? Because everybody's doing multiple roles and stuff. And so that's an appropriate time to bring it up to you. I mean, ideally, I think at the beginning. Particularly if you're familiar with the director, if you have any kind of relationship with them, you can just make it a conversation.
And I was really fortunate to, when I was like starting out, the editor I was working with, I was an assistant for a long time. That editor kind of had say, I guess, in terms of like what my credit was, and I sort of timidly went at the end of the project. And I was like, can I get a co-editor credit? And they were like, yeah, like that's what I was thinking. And, you know, there was an advocacy on the part of the person who was, you know, senior. And I think that's where like relationships come in, and hopefully good people.
Always advocating for your crew. Just one last question from the audience. Does somebody already have the mic?
Pull through. Jason. Jason.
Sorry, I was just tired. Maybe just be quick. My question is around, I love this discussion, but first, thank you all for your time. Around the assistant editors, potential gain writer's credit, or some sort of writer's credit, some sort of hierarchy of that writer's credit. And I think about that because I was on this really great project where it was all virtual, where everybody was in the room virtually. Everyone was contributing to story. We all had like different people contributing fantastic ideas. The other ADEs great ideas. I did ideas. I was an AD on that project. How do you feel like maybe the industry could evolve to maybe incorporate some of the assistant editors to this process if they are in fact a part of making the edit, which tends to happen a lot, and then people obviously level up. So I'm curious for your take on that.
I mean, but my assistant is right by. But we've been on a lot of films together. Actually, this is our fourth, and she is actually getting a better credit on this film. She's and the director is also here. The whole family's here. And she does contribute a lot to the story often. And I would say the times where she hasn't, it's not been because she couldn't, it's because there was not enough money to have her around for the times when it would be useful. So yeah, I'm kind of like not precious about, I want to be the only one who has that credit. I think everybody who contributed to deciding the structure of the film and the look and feel and the story should. So also, yeah, like the director, and even if maybe one of the producers was really creatively involved or something, like I don't think, I'm not fighting to hold on to very preciously and only be mine.
I think in some ways, the larger fight, I mean, for me anyway, is to just have an assistant editor who is consistently available throughout the film, and in order to provide the mentorship and all of that, because it's been a while since that's been possible. So, but yeah, once that person is there, then I will be advocating for them in every way possible.
Yeah, and I think this is maybe like where the issue of resources kind of comes in, that Stephanie mentioned earlier, which is like, if the assistant editors are stretched so thin, across different episodes of a thing, or the workload is just too much, it leaves very little room for more than kind of technical or problem solving issues, and when there is space, when that workload is sort of more manageable, there can be contributions, there can be discussions, whether it be more formal, like it sounds like what you're talking about, to just kind of like water kind of conversations and stuff that can make the film. And in those cases, yeah, I think the assistant should be appropriately acknowledged, whatever that credit is.
Yeah, I think it's very hard to make the leap out of assistant into associate engineer editor into full editor, and in any way I can support people trying to do that, I will, including be fair about their credit and realistic about their contributions.
Most importantly, tell your editor you want to cut, and you want to learn. Okay, that is all our time somehow. Thank you so
Thank you, Eric.